So for whatever reason, our ancestors were the first pilgrims out of Africa 1.8 million years ago. We may never know. But we can look at some of the earliest evidence for that migration and kind of look at the sort of world that they had created for themselves. We know that they could make pretty nice stone tools, which we call Acheulean culture, or Acheulean hand axes, or simply hand axes, because they fit so nicely into your hand. They're shaped teardrop like that. They're bifacial, which means that they're flaked on one side, turned over, and flaked on the other side. And you see this very nice cutting edge that results on both sides, and it can be resharpened. But what's also interesting is that they had a specific shape in mind. So they were pretty good at making these tools that go back to about 1.8 million years ago, but they endure in the archaeological record to some 200,000 years ago. So for 1.6 million years, people were making hand axes. They seemed to really like these. And Homo erectus, that broad group, was making these. And it appears to be something that originated in Africa, and they liked it, and it was just make hand axe, make hand axe. They didn't make a lot of other artifacts. They used flakes and chunks of rock for cutting, but the oldest ones found at Lake Turkana are about 1.8 million years ago. And there are literally millions of these in museums, and people don't know exactly how they were used. Some people think they were used for throwing. I'm not big on that idea. I don't think they were hafted on the end of a wooden spear. I think that they were efficient Swiss Army knives, beginning way back 1.8 million years, that they used for everything. Probably used for cutting wood, sharpening wood, cutting flesh, skinning an animal. And experimental archaeologists who go out and make these things and use them show how effective they are in skinning an animal or cutting the meat. So you didn't have to process that in your mouths. Well, there is a huge controversy in paleoanthropology concerning whether or not Erectus was a hunter. Hunting and procuring meat was an important element in our evolution, as I pointed out, with probably beginning with Homo habilis, or maybe even much, much further back, even more than 3 million years ago, because this was such a high energy food source and fed that hungry organ, the brain. In fact, in the 1960s, there was a perception that man the hunter was the crucial move in behavior that brought us our large brains. We know that scavenging, hunting, and collecting, food gathering, are all important elements. But certainly this was a way to get high energy food. The evidence for Homo erectus as a hunter is very unclear. There are some sites in Spain, like Torralba and Ambrona, but the evidence isn't very clear. Maybe they were very good scavengers and understood the behavior of primary carnivores like lions and leopards, and had ways of scaring them off and coming in and taking what they could. We don't know. But they used, obviously, these hand axes because they are found in such profusion. And they could have been used to crack open a skull, to eat one of those wonderful things. Brains are very nutritious. Bone marrow, they could have used to break up bones, as well as meat off of the bones. Very interesting. Hallam Movius was an archaeologist, well known at Harvard University, who dug a lot of places, but mainly in southwest France. And he noticed that there are no hand axes in Asia. I didn't mention any hand axes with Homo erectus, did I? And hand axes are in Africa and in Europe and up to this line right here, called the Movius line. And beyond that, you don't find them. Now, if we got out of Africa just after or just before these tools were invented, maybe they didn't travel with the first people coming out of Africa. The evidence today suggests that that might be the case. Maybe population densities were so small that some groups forgot how to make them. We don't know. Another hypothesis is that in Asia, here, people were beginning to use another very hard substance, and that's bamboo. And perhaps they were making a lot of these tools and spears and slicing devices and so on out of bamboo, and of course they would not have fossilized. Did they use fire? Yes, I'm sure they used fire. But did they control fire? We don't know if they controlled fire. It's very hard to figure out if they could make fire, if they could control fire. We know they used fire because at least 1 million years ago in Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, there are hearths. In Israel, there is a site about 800,000 years where they were making fire. But at 1.7 million years, very difficult to show. Fire would have been wonderful. Keep you warm at night, keep predators away, a nice place to sit around at night, and it, of course, could be used to cook food and make it more digestible and easier chewing. Some people think this goes back to 1.8 million years, but the evidence is still very unclear. And controlling fire is very different from just using fire from natural lightning strikes, for example. All right, when did hominins get out of Africa? What was their first occurrence in Europe, if we can include Western Russia? Well, there's a site in Dmanisi in Georgia, which is located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is over here, along the Silk Route. And there was a monastery. And years ago, a paleontologist found fossilized bones in the cellar, in the floor of the cellar. And there were elephants and all sorts of animals. And most recently, beginning in 1991, a group of archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, began digging there. And this mandible, this beautiful mandible, with an absolutely complete dentition, all 16 teeth preserved there, as you can see, was recovered. So we knew that there was a chance of finding more humans there. And here's the site in just here in Dmanisi, which is not far from the capital of Tbilisi, in what is today called Georgia. Well, who were these guys? Some people have just simply called them Homo erectus because of the large brows. Others suggest that they were really something else and more similar to skulls from east of Lake Turkana called Homo ergaster, which we've mentioned. They were modern body build, long lower limbs. They were similar to ergaster, as I said, and David Lordica-Panizzi, who is director of the museum in Tbilisi, suggests that there's perhaps a second species, but one species closely resembles Homo ergaster. But they look at the small size of the brain. These brains are about 600 to 775 cubic centimeters, the size of Homo habilis brains, as you might remember. In fact, they do have some resemblances to things in Eastern Africa, as I said, Homo ergaster. Well, what's fascinating about them is that they didn't bring hand axes with them. They are 1.8 million years old, and that is determined on the basis of a volcanic layer that can be dated using argon dating. So we know how old these are. It was an astonishing observation that they were that old. So we know that our ancestors got out about 1.8 million years ago. They didn't bring hand axes with them because the tools found with them are more rudimentary tools like Oldowan tools, like these pebble tools. They had a small brain. There's no evidence of fire. And what that means is that large brains, sophisticated tools, and so on weren't really necessary for the first exodus out of Africa. That they got out and did pretty well. Well, if you look at them, they have big brow ridges, as you can see. They have very prognathic and projecting faces. They have that erectine-like cast to them. These do not seem to have the sagittal keel like you see in Homo erectus, as we looked at in China and in Java. They have a more smooth, more rounded cranium like you see in Homo ergaster. So a very interesting piece of evidence for the earliest out of Africa, 1.8 million, right through present-day Georgia. Well, there's a surprising discovery that was announced just a little over a decade ago from Java, of all places. And it actually wasn't from Java, it was from Indonesia, and it was from an island way out at the end of the archipelago called Flores. Beautiful island, not very populated, an island I visited recently, very green, and there's a large, large cave there. You can see how big it is. Look at how small the people are in the group of friends I brought over there. And this enormous opening, and the stalactites and stalagmites. And one of the dangers of excavating here is that there are frequent earthquakes in a country like Indonesia, where you've got 150 active volcanoes and lots of earthquakes. And sometimes these things come down and they could spear you and kill you. But you see the excavations in what is called Liangbua Cave, and which was really work began there in about 2001. Well, in 2003, astonishingly, this partial skeleton, not as complete as some of the others, but pretty darn complete, with really big, long feet. And you can see that here. Relatively speaking, they had big feet. They were short. The length of that thigh bone is about the same length as Lucy. These were 3.5 feet tall. 3 feet, 7 inches, about 1.09 meters in size. They were tiny. Their brains, believe it or not, were only 417 cubic centimeters. I think the date of only 13,000 years ago is going to be pushed back a little bit, perhaps as much as 50,000 years. We have to wait for details. But it means they survived until 50,000 years ago. They're sometimes called the hobbits, after the movie and the book. This is supposed to be a female. They're found with simple flake tools, and they were eating things like dragons and dwarf elephants. But what were they doing there? Where did they come from? Why are they so small? Why are they so primitive in terms of brain size as recently as 50,000 years ago? Even the aspects of certain bones, particularly wrist bones, show that these are very primitive hands. Well, who were they? When they were first announced, and they were put into the genus Homo, I think because they were making tools, which is not the best thing to do, but they were called Homo floresiensis. With a brain that size, I'm surprised they weren't put into the genus Australopithecus. But when this was announced in the journals a few years ago, people were in disbelief. This is one of the biggest surprises. Remember Piltdown? Some people were saying, I wonder if this is really true. Well, it's true. I've held the specimens, I've looked at them, they're fossilized, they are of that antiquity, and they're about the same stature as Australopithecus afarensis, and some people have been weighing different hypotheses. Was this a microcephalic dwarf? Well, it doesn't show any of the deformities and characteristics of a dwarf. Were they just short people? And there is a particular process which is known as island dwarfing. Off the coast of California, in the Santa Cruz Islands, for example, you find dwarf elephants. In the Mediterranean, on some islands, you find dwarf elephants. On the island of Flores, you find these dwarf elephants. Here you see them over here. They're very small. Well, what makes them small? Mammals compete for natural resources. And the smaller you are, the less you have to eat. So there's a tendency for natural selection to select small-sized mammals. So were they the result of dwarfism? Did they evolve from Homo erectus? Did they evolve from something much more ancient that came out of Africa that was similar to Homo habilis. Because even if they evolved from Homo erectus, you don't go from more modern hands to more primitive hands. So these are a huge enigma, Homo floresiensis, that have opened up a whole new series of ideas. Work is still going on at the cave under the direction of my Indonesian colleagues and a former student of ours at Arizona State University, Matt Tucheri, pictured here, who is a specialist of hand bones. He is giving me the great privilege here, as you see, of looking at the actual fossils of Homo floresiensis. And he is working very closely with his Indonesian colleagues, and I'm sure that we're going to hear more about this fascinating, unusual, and totally surprising discovery of Homo floresiensis.